If you want to follow along, you can grab one of the Bibles somewhere. Verse 28. If a man happens to meet a virgin who is not pledged to be married. Okay, before we go any further, this is a continuation of last week. We're talking about sexual assault in the Old Testament. And so, just to let you know, sitting here, and for those that are listening to this, this is of sensitive nature in areas that we don't usually talk about in church, but we need to. So when I read this, this is coming right out of the Bible. Okay? If a man happens to meet a virgin who is not pledged to be married and rapes her, and they are discovered, you have to look elsewhere to find out what happens if they're not discovered. God has actually plans for them as well. He shall pay her father 50 shekels of silver. He must marry the young woman, for he has violated her. He can never divorce her for as long as he lives. So this is a continuation of the discussion last week where we talked about the Me Too movement and sexual assault, what's appropriate and inappropriate. So this week I want to spend time in the Old Testament and look at these passages. Here's the theological question, the theological conundrum that these passages present. Does this represent the redemptive God that we know, we worship, we enjoy, we spend time, we sing about? Does it represent that God? If so, why don't we obey it today? If it doesn't, what's it doing as a command in the Mosaic Law? It's a theological challenge. We have to work through it. Quite honestly, these are the passages, there's many more like them in the Old Testament that draw my attention. Never heard them preached on, so I'm brave enough to try it, because if it's in the Bible, we need to talk about it. Honestly, when I got to seminary, I wanted to know more about these passages, and when we got to these passages, we kind of slid right over them. They're very complicated. And the church has struggled to know what to do with them. So this has become part of my journey to figure out these texts. I have said for a long time, I believe it to be true, as long as we talk about the peace, love, and happiness texts, we look a lot like Hinduism. Because they have very similar language. It's in these passages, these very troublesome passages, where Christianity begins to differentiate itself from every religion in the world. And most of them are found in the Old Testament. If you've ever read the Old Testament, you know what I'm talking about. We have genocide texts, we have sex assault texts. Why didn't God just say don't do it? Why? Women were treated with indignity as property. Why didn't he just say don't? So let's start with a very basic question before we unravel these two verses. Do you believe God is redemptive? If you believe God's redemptive, raise your hands. It's probably everybody in here. So let's start with the premise. Don't believe the older style of thinking that God is a God of wrath in the Old Testament and God of grace in the New Testament. Don't believe it. That just makes him bipolar. And that's not the God that we serve. So therefore, we have to make sense of this. If we actually believe that God is redemptive, then we should be able to go to any of these passages and make sense of it in light of that. I believe he is redemptive, and we're going to take a look at this. So that's this passage. That's the beginning of the journey, because you have to start with that premise that we serve a God who is alive, who cares, who loves every human on the planet. In fact, I believe that is the basic definition of the gospel. We've said more than once, we've used the example, you're sitting on an airplane and you say to the person next to you, what's that book about? And they say, that book's a mystery, or it's a history of Western civilization. I'm taking a class at college. And they say, what's this book about? The Bible. How do you answer it? However you answer that question needs to take into account genocide texts, rape texts, and a whole bunch of other things. Here's how I answer it. This is the story of the one true loving God. who cares about every human on the planet and is willing to compromise for the sake of the gospel. See, I believe the Bible is one long story comprised with thousands of sub-stories. All have something in common. God compromises for the sake of the gospel. No, he never wanted rape. Of course not. He never wanted genocide. Of course not. He didn't want any of that. In fact, they all represent compromise on his part so he can bring society to a better place. Even Jesus, when he says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, even that's a statement of compromise. Because we now know the Roman government was funding euthanasia, infanticide, abortion, worship of many gods, the building of temples. None of those are what God wants. But for the sake of the gospel, pay your taxes so that, as Peter says, on the day that he visits us, the world will know that we were true believers. And so we begin with, number one, God is a God of redemption. And number two, he's willing to compromise for the sake of the gospel. When you think about your individual lives, and your lives represent a model of what the Bible is all about. You come to know Christ one day, and then you begin that journey. You begin that journey of faithfulness, of learning about him. Oh, you stumble and fall, but you get back up and you keep going. You sin, you get back up and keep going. That's true of all of us. But every step of the way, the longer you serve him, the more you become like him. You become more gracious, more loving, more affectionate, more forgiving, right? You become more like him. He's never in a hurry to violate your personal will. That's the great thing about our God. He bestows dignity through giving us choice. He gave it to Adam and Eve. He's never in a hurry. Well, that's what he does at a national level. And so the Bible is a story of a very long period of time that demonstrates that same pattern. As he demonstrates and reveals himself to culture, culture begins to shift and to change. We call that redemption. You see, the very nature of redemption is something's not working right, and God steps in to fix it. You get yourself in a jam and you can't get out. That's what salvation is all about. And so God steps into culture to fix what is broken. And this is an example of something that is very broken. So whenever God steps into culture, he does three things. I'm going to illustrate it in two different passages. Three things. Number one is he begins to restrain evil practices in the world. He begins to restrain it. Number two, he introduces human dignity, morality. There's nothing innate to us, I believe, that is moral by nature. I used to think there were a lot of things that were moral, just human nature, because of the culture I was raised in here in the U.S. And then I started teaching overseas. This is my 20th year of teaching in third world countries. And guess what I've discovered? I don't think there's anything that's innate to us. I believe certain values because of the way I was raised, not because it's in here. C.S. Lewis argued, I think, many years ago that all of us have a moral compass. It's just broken. We want to know what's right, but we can't find true north. It's doing this. It's broken. So how does morality enter into the discussion? God's involvement in culture with his people, with us. That is one of the primary roles of the church, to reveal his glory and at the same time demonstrate what good morality looks like. Good marriages, integrity, all the things that we hold true. That's where it comes. So, number one, he restrains evil. Number two is he introduces human dignity. And number three, he establishes true north, the pattern of where we're heading. We need God to do that. Because of the fall, what theologians call total depravity, we have an absolute mess on our hands. Absolute mess. Honestly, what's happening in the media and the press is a gift. It's always been there. It's just now coming out. It's an absolute mess. I've said many times, you see something beautiful here as believers, that's good. But don't be deceived. Right underneath the surface is a whole lot of brokenness. Spend 5,000 coffees with your friends and neighbors and you'll learn all about it. It's everywhere. And so he points that direction, and we have a role to play to bring that morality to the table. So I'm going to illustrate it in Deuteronomy chapter 25. Okay? Deuteronomy 25, that'll help you understand how this works. When people have a dispute, they're to take it to the court, and the judges will decide the case, acquitting the innocent and condemning the guilty. If the guilty person deserves to be beaten, the judge shall make them lie down and have them flogged in the presence of the number of lashes the crime deserves. Now, don't think of just a nice, easy beating. Think of somebody stretched out with a baseball bat on the lower back, a rod, a hard, thick rod. Okay? Think of that. That's what you got. But the judge must not impose more than 40 lashes. So if we laid somebody down, strapped them down, and beat them with a bat 40 times, what would happen to us? We go to jail. Right? Is there any clearer picture of abuse than that? What's this doing? It's the same question. Does this represent the God we know? What's this doing in the command? As a command in the Mosaic Law. If the guilty party is flogged more than that, your fellow Israelite will be degraded in your eyes. Okay. Principle number 1, he begins to restrain evil practices. We now have through archaeology and other things, we have the law codes on how to treat adults in both the Assyrian culture and the Egyptian culture. So the Egyptian culture, at the time that this is part of the Pentateuch, they just come out 40 years ago out of Egypt. So they would be familiar with this. You know what the discipline practices were in Egypt at this time? You could beat somebody 200 times and create up to 5 open wounds. There was no limit placed on the husband how many times he could beat the wife. None. So, principle number 1, God begins to restrain practices in the world, evil practices. We've gone from 200 lashes or beatings with 5 open wounds, down to 40. Principle number 2, he introduces human dignity into the discussion. None of the ancient, as far as I can tell, the ancient law codes had dignity even discussed. As far as I can tell, murder was never discussed from a moral perspective until the 10 Commandments, 1500 BC. It was discussed from a utilitarian perspective. So if I murder one of your family members, we're not going to get along very well. But we have no compunction murdering the people on the other side of the county. And so it's based on utilitarian principles, practicality, not morality. And so when God comes along and says, do not murder, he introduces morality and dignity into the equation. Well, that's what he's doing right here with this one. If you beat them more than 40 times, they will be degraded in your eyes. The other nations hadn't thought of that. That's dignity. Every human has dignity. Then he points the direction to true north. Okay, so now we know, here's what's happening with the Egyptian culture. We're limited to 40. We're introducing dignity. Every human has dignity, and we don't want to harm them. We don't want to destroy that. Now we have a roadmap, which culminates in the new covenant. Turn the other cheek. Do good to those who hate you. Love your enemies. Right? Jesus is teaching and Paul's teaching. Well, the same is going to be true in Deuteronomy 22, right here. And this whole question of sexual assault. All right, so we live in a world, back then, where sexual assault, women are considered property, and you could pretty much do what you want with them. You see, if I own a virgin, if I own a daughter or a servant, she's a virgin, she has monetary value to me. And so I had to protect her. It's like I do my cattle. They're worth something. I have here, I'm going to read to you a sample out of the what we call the Middle Assyrian law, the period of the Middle Assyrians. This probably is about 300 years after this passage was written, but it gives us an indication of how the surrounding nations thought about this whole question of sexual assault. Okay, now remember principle number 1. You see, tell me if you hear it. God restrains evil. If a man forcibly seizes and rapes a maiden who is residing in her father's house, that's a virgin, who is not betrothed, in other words, who's not married, because when you became betrothed, because you're property women, you now belong to another man. Okay, so the husband could sell a daughter to some other man, and he gets paid for it. So it's a financial transaction. So if a man forcibly seizes and rapes this virgin who's not married, so she belongs to the man of the house, the father, within the city or in the main thoroughfare, in other words, within the city, okay, ready for this? The father of the maiden, the father of the maiden or the virgin shall take the wife of the perpetrator, the man who raped her. Are we clear on this? Shall take the other man's wife and hand her over to be raped. Basically by the men of the city. He shall not return her to her husband, but he shall take her for himself. He gets to keep her from then on. The father shall give his daughter, who is the victim of fornication or rape, into the protection of the household of the fornicator, the perpetrator. So basically it's an exchange of women. Okay? You rape my daughter, she's yours. She's not damaged goods. I can't get the money out of her. But the law goes on that the perpetrator has to pay triple the silver for the maiden. And the father can give her to whoever he wants to be married to. How would you like to live back then? The wife pays the price for the husband's indiscretion. So to make it financially equal, he has to pay. Because it's property. Might as well be a cow. Is that brutal or what? That's the world that God steps into. Now look what he says. If a man happens to meet a virgin who's not pledged to be married, and he rapes her, and they are discovered, he shall pay her father 50 shekels of silver. Nothing in here about the other man's wife. That's beginning to mitigate an evil practice. Okay? He still has to pay the fine. But the law goes on. He must marry the young woman because he has dishonored her. All of a sudden, in the Assyrian law, the one who's been dishonored is the owner of the virgin. But in the Old Testament, the one who's been dishonored is the virgin who's been raped or assaulted. You see how that transfer just occurred? The transfer just occurred. God introduces dignity. It's no longer a financial matter. It's now a matter of dishonor. We talked about that last week, didn't we? Sexual assault always leads to dishonoring of someone's body, the loss of control. It's been forcibly taken by someone else. And so God begins this long, slow journey of restoring dignity, restoring honor to the virgin, not to the man. You see how that shift occurred? This is a massive shift in world history. Leads us to a very different place today. He can never divorce her for as long as he lives. Now, we know from the ancient rabbis that the way they understood this, because dignity was now given to the one who has been raped, they began to offer her freedom. You get to choose if you're going to marry this person or not. That's the story of Numbers 31 with the daughters of Zelophehad. They were told to marry and they said no. So they took the case Moses did to God, and God said they have a valid case. Let them marry who they want. And so they're beginning to introduce into world culture, world history, different ways of thinking. We actually have a story of this passage. That's the story of Tamar and Amnon. Both children of David. Some of you know the story. Two different mothers. And Amnon has a thing for Tamar, so he pretends to be sick, lures her into his bedchamber, and then sexually assaults her. And she says, don't do this thing which is so detestable. Ask my father, he will give me to you as a wife. And so he does it anyway, and it's true, all rape, and she's not worth anything after that, he kicks her out. Slams the door behind her, and as he's kicking her out, she says, please don't do this second detestable thing. You can still ask my father, he'll give me to you as a wife. And so he kicks her out. So she does the only culturally acceptable thing. She can no longer marry because now she's been violated. So she tears her sleeves. That's a public statement that I'm no longer a virgin. It's a statement of shame, humility, embarrassment. Absalom, her brother, takes her into his house, where she lives for 2 years, and he protects her. And he waits for David to do something about it, and David doesn't, so he goes and kills Amnon. That's the beginning of the 9-year slide of David's life, where he sins. Soon after that, it's Bathsheba, and he eventually loses his kingdom to his son Absalom. One sin after another. But it begins with the fact that he didn't protect the honor of his daughter. He should have marched right over to Amnon's house and said, I know what you did. And here's what the law says. You're going to marry her. You're going to pay me. I don't need the money, but you're going to pay it anyway. And you're going to restore her honor by taking care of her and giving her children. That's how honor was valued. And if you don't, we're going to drag you out in the streets and stone you. He didn't do that. You see, this passage right here, when you put it in the context of all the ancient nations, is that God's process to begin to restore dignity and honor to the ones, the victims who had no control themselves. If God doesn't intervene, then we would be like all the other nations. So he begins to protect the one who has been violated, who has lost control to someone else. Someone else has stolen it from her. Does that make sense? You follow what I'm saying? So this actually shows how God is redemptive within Israelite culture to separate them from the Syrians, the Egyptians, all the surrounding nations. If a man happens to meet a virgin who's not pledged to be married and rapes her, and they are discovered, he shall pay her father 50 shekels of silver. He must marry the young woman. What's not in here, he must marry her if that's what she and her father want. They have the freedom. And that's how the Jewish rabbis interpreted it. He is not given the choice. The man's not. Because he's the one that is. And the reason is because he has violated her, he has dishonored her. He can never divorce her for as long as he lives. It's a very cruel, very brutal world. But when God steps in, he begins that process, restraining evil, introducing dignity or morality, starting to make the turn in culture to what is right and what he desires, and in the process, pointing us to true north. When we come back for communion, I'm going to read part of 1 Corinthians 7 so you can see where we end up in the new covenant. Father, thank you for being a God that we truly believe is redemptive. That you care about us as individuals as well as care about us as nations. You care about your entire creation. Thank you for being a God that when you step into our world, you start to put the rights, all that's wrong. And then you use us to show the world what right looks like, what goodness looks like, what honor and dignity look like through our marriages and our relationships. Thanks for being that kind of God. We love you, and we pray and thank you in your Son's name. Amen. And ask the ushers to